Right. So this is going to be the first video in what is hopefully going to be a series. And that series is going to be taking a look at characters in Reverse 1999 and basically just exploring their allusions to real life events or people. Because as we know, a lot of the characters in here have some sort of connection to something that's happened, or a person, or a concept, or even just an object in the real world. And today we're going to be taking a look at Eternity. Now, while a lot of the characters in the game's references are fairly straightforward, you've got Rabies, who is Rabies, you've got Sputnik, who is Sputnik, and then you've got a Poltergeist, who is basically, I assume, a poltergeist. Eternity is a little bit odd. While she does have a reference, it's not immediately apparent. It's kind of obfuscated and hidden in her story files, it's hidden in her voice lines, and a lot of it is kind of up to interpretation, though there are some things that I feel are solid enough that with a bit of research you probably could come to the same conclusions. But yeah, in this video I'm just going to be going ahead and breaking down what exactly makes up Eternity. Eternity's surface level bio is fairly straightforward. It says that she was exhibited in the 1990s for over a century. She was completed in winter on December 25th, and she was first exhibited in Exeter, USA, while later being displayed all over America. Now, if you weren't certain, this is basically just a strange way of detailing a arcanist's life trajectory in a very concise manner. Right. You could just read this as she was born in the 1990s, she lived for over a century, and her birthday is December 25th in Exeter. It's fairly straightforward. Nothing too interesting there. The fact that she is from Exeter is going to be important later, but aside from that, nothing too interesting. What is interesting are her stats. Eternity's medium is blue blood. Now, the immediate connotation of blue blood is that of nobility. If you were in a higher social standing, you would probably be said to have blue blood, or you were a blue blood. And that kind of tracks based on, just her general disposition, what she wears, the way she carries herself, all of that. It's fairly straightforward. It connects, simple enough. Now, I do think there is also a second meaning to this, and that is in reference to horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs have bright blue blood, and this blood is used in the production of vaccines. Specifically, it reacts if there are pathogens or contaminants in the vaccine. That's not quite as important. And it's a little bit odd, but you got to remember that Eternity has a lot of references to the sea just based on her design, based on her skills, based on her lines. She references creatures of the sea and the sea itself quite a lot. And additionally, the species of horseshoe crab are actually incredibly old. They predate the dinosaurs, which is interesting. Her fragrance is aquatic, as you'd probably expect. Seawater, basil, patchouli, ambergris. I looked into these. I didn't really find anything terribly striking about it. No references I could suss out or anything like that. As a side note, if you don't know what ambergris is, it is basically whale vomit. Stuff sort of congeals in their guts and they puke it out, and it washes ashore, and it's actually extremely expensive because it is used for perfume. I don't know why, but that's what it is. Her afflatus is everlasting tridactyne, and mineral, the sale of magical items. The second part is fairly self-explanatory, but what is tridactyne? Tridactyne is a family of animals, which includes the giant clams. Again, we get a creature that is associated with the sea, and bonus points for it to being shellfish, which is typically associate something that Rhode Island, where she is from, is associated with. Now, giant clams are typically fairly long-lived. They can have a lifespan of over 100 years old. So again, there's another sea creature with a reference to, you know, resilience or age or just longevity in general. Eternity's items give us a little bit of insight into some additional background of her character reference. So let's go ahead and get into those. Now I did look up this word online, just how to pronounce it. I believe the etymology is Greek, so I will be using that pronunciation. The first item is Evrivia, the Ocean series. Now these seem to be her earrings, and they are styled after jellyfish. Released in 1893 by Evrivia, the Ocean series immediately became the upper class's favorite for its artful design and unique color, which is slightly better than the Prussian blue. As time passed, this color has gradually become the color of Evrivia. Now, in looking up this reference, I found that Evrivia is a minor Titan deity in Greek mythology. Specifically, she is one that is very heavily associated with the sea, which, again, eternity is also heavily associated with the sea. As far as her role, Evrivia doesn't actually serve any major role in the story of Greek mythology. She is mainly referenced as the mother and ancestor to some more notable gods and titans. However, I do think that it is at least a little bit interesting that Eternity does kind of refer to herself in a motherly role and refers to us as her child. I don't think there's a huge tie-in here, I just found it interesting, so I wanted to mention it. Her second item is the Evrivia Century Collection 1893 series sling bag. In 1993, the collection made its debut at New York's Spring-Summer Fashion Week in Bryant Park. At the time, Evrivia, known for its jewel series, was already one of the leading brands in the fashion industry. Until today, the demand for this purse remains extremely high among luxury collectors. It is a flying jellyfish handbag, and it is only 3,000 sharpedontes. Again, we get more water stuff, more stuff to do with the sea. In this context, jellyfish are kind of an interesting choice. There is a species of jellyfish, commonly called the immortal jellyfish, that is capable of basically reversing its life cycle. What this means is that once it hits a certain point, once it's matured, it will rewind and return to a larval state, essentially, becoming a baby again. And this effectively means that it is immortal. Now, between this jellyfish, horseshoe crabs, and the giant clams, Eternity has quite a few references to creatures sea creatures specifically, that are either incredibly long-lived or just incredibly resilient in some fashion. And, I mean, that fits her, right? There's 3 of them. One, you could say I'm just being a conspiracy theorist and seeing things that aren't there, right? With 2, maybe it's a coincidence, but once you get to 3, I'd like to believe there's at least a little bit there, right? So I figured it was worth at least mentioning or bringing up. The third item is an early Victorian period piece of antique jewelry. A classic piece of jewelry from the Romantic period. Unlike stamped jewelry, the nature-themed patterns on it are hand-carved by skillful jewelers. What's more, its current owner's glamour is a good compliment to its beauty. I didn't really find anything on this. The flowers, I believe, are probably whitewood asters, the scientific name of which is Euphrevia divaricata. Beyond sharing the name with the rest of her item line, I really didn't find too much to link to any like real deep connections with IRL stuff. But that is the last of her items. So it's at this point that we get to her stories, and this is probably what I think is the most interesting part of her entire bio. Particularly her story 1. Her story 1, sealed candy jar. At the end of the 19th century, torches constantly lit up the night sky of Exeter, a frontier town in the USA. The door of her store was closed. In a dimly lit room, on the shelves stood many candy jars. The last young buyer of these candies had been sent to that crowded, shabby cemetery, if you prefer to call it that, 3 months ago. Too many farms had been destroyed in the Civil War, and plague was not the only terrible thing to develop from the ashes. Fear of an unknown future also gradually turned to madness. The candies were taken down. Instead, the store owners now stocked their shelves with garlic necklaces and bottles of holy water. More and more vampires were brought to that trial, and the seed of suspicion grew in everyone's mind. The once friendly residents became ruthless intruders and broke into the woman's house despite the help she had provided them. But they found nothing in her house. It seemed to have been long abandoned. The floor was covered with dead shellfish, under which there were marks of dried blue blood. Peace didn't come back to the town of Exeter until the day when everyone heard about a disease called tuberculosis. I believe that this first story is actually referencing a very specific case in US history. Specifically, I think it's referencing the Mercy Brown vampire case that happened in Exeter, Rhode Island in 1892. Now, I think this because Eternity's story specifically mentions vampires and tuberculosis, which were kind of the driving factors in this historical case. There was a family, the Brown family, that consisted of the patriarch, George, the mother, Mary Eliza, the daughter, Mary Olive, the younger daughter, Mercy, and the son, Edwin. The mother had become stricken with tuberculosis, though they didn't actually know this. She had just fallen ill. And despite their best efforts, she wound up dying. She was followed by the eldest daughter, Mary Olive, and then finally Mercy succumbed to the disease as well. Afterwards, her brother Edwin wound up also contracting the disease. Now, the thing about New England in the 18th century is that these people were typically quite superstitious. They believed that if a familial bloodline were afflicted with repeated occurrences of misfortune or disease, that it was a product of supernatural interference. A curse, basically, which is what they thought was occurring with the Brown family. They believed that a vampire specifically had cursed their family and was now responsible for Edwin's sickness. To this end, they petitioned the patriarch, George, who had not contracted the disease yet, to exhume the family members' bodies because they believed that one of the family members had now become a vampire. Which, I mean, that's gotta be one heck of a conversation to have, right? Like, the man's family is basically just dropping one by one, and they come up and tell him that they want to dig up the bodies because one of them might be a vampire and responsible for this entire thing. How do you even approach that conversation, right? In any case, George relented, and the 3 bodies were disinterred. Of those 3, 2 of them had decayed normally as was expected, but Mercy Brown's body specifically looked as if it hadn't been touched by rot at all. In fact, later they actually found that there was still blood pooling in the heart. Not pumping, mind you, but it was there, just sitting in the heart when it really shouldn't have been. And naturally, they took this to mean that Mercy Brown was the vampire. So in accordance with the normal procedure of the time, which it's kind of wild that they had a procedure for this sort of thing to begin with, They cut out her heart and her liver, they burned them up, and mixed those ashes into water. And then they fed this concoction to Edwin in the hopes that this would somehow cure him. As it turns out, ash water is not a valid form of medicine for tuberculosis, and Edwin wound up succumbing to his disease 2 months later. As a fun little aside, it is thought that the reporting of this case was seen by Bram Stoker, and it was in part an inspiration for Dracula. Not relevant, just interesting, right? Now, as you can see, there are certain parallels in both of these stories. The time period is the same, the location is the same. A small, peaceful town being thrust into the throes of vampire hysteria is the same. And even the final diagnosis, which is tuberculosis, is the same. Which is why I believe that this first story is actually just a different telling of the Mercy Brown case from a different point of view. However, I also believe that this is actually a pivotal point for Eternity as a character as well. I don't believe that Eternity before this point was actually immortal. She was certainly long-lived, but I don't think that she was entirely undying as we have her now. There are a couple of reasons for this, so let's go ahead and just enumerate those, right? The first point is this line in her story where it says, "They found nothing in her house. It seemed to have been long abandoned. The floor was covered with dead shellfish under which there were marks of dried blue blood." Now, to me, this does not sound like a struggle. This does not sound like she was attacked or anything. This sounds like a ritual or some form of rite. The dried blue blood. Remember, blue blood is Eternity's medium. In this context, a medium is something that is used to facilitate a deed or a rite, right? So for a painter, their medium of choice would be paint. In this case, for Eternity, whatever her magic is, requires blue blood as, the sort of go-between. The second point is her monologue line. In Exeter, death only spared me. I often feel like a scarecrow. Everything around me keeps changing, growing, and eventually comes to an end. But I remain unchanged and alone. Death only spared me. This implies that, at least for some time, death did have a sway over her. Like there was still the ability for her to die, but specifically in Exeter, death spared her. At this point, she is no longer under the shadow of death. Now, we're definitely getting into like some weird theory time, which is fine. That's all right. But what I think is going on here is that she had returned to Exeter, the place of her birth. Remember, she was going around the country. It says in her bio that she was displayed around the country for over the course of a century. But she returned after about 100 years to Exeter, and she proceeded to attempt this rite, which would make her completely untouched by death. And it seems like that it had worked. One other point that I'd like to mention is that I don't actually think Eternity is naturally long-lived. Now, I could be wrong. Arcanists might just have that as a perk, or this is something specific to Eternity, but I don't think so. I think that Eternity was born with a normal lifespan. She was just a normal arcanist, but searched actively for a way to, stave off her eventual end. And in doing so, she kind of found ways to extend her life in such a way that even after 100 years, she remained unchanged up until she managed to find a way to properly make herself immortal. So what is my basis for this? It's actually one of her skills, her passive skill, Solitude for 100 years. It says gain immunity to bleed, corrode, and poison statuses. When a round starts, the caster gains 1 stack of blood of longevity, damage dealt 3%, damage healed 3%, and it stacks up to 5 times. So right off the bat, 100 years is fitting. It fits within our timeline very well, because Eternity was born in the 1990s, and as a result of the reverse, we're going back in time, so after 100 years would be in the 1890s, which is when all of this is taking place. But the part I really want to focus on is this blood of longevity. Longevity, I can say it. Not immortality, longevity. However, after getting the 5 stacks, you get blood of immortality, which just gives you buff stats. It doesn't matter, that's not important. So consider it this way. This is a very good parallel to the theory that I brought up, right? She is, over the course of 100 years, she is stacking up longevity. She is finding ways to make herself live longer. And then after that 100 years is up, and she's now back in Exeter, that's when she finally obtains the blood of immortality. She becomes immortal. And she does this by performing a rite that involves blue blood and a lot of sea creatures. Now, whether this is directly correlated to the Mercy Brown case, or if it's just incidental, I am unsure of. However, if this story actually is referencing such an obscure case, I feel like it would be very odd to not have any direct tie-ins beyond, she just happened to be there at the time. Now, if we were going to go really dark with it, maybe Eternity's pursuit of immortality is the catalyst of this whole incident. Maybe the outbreak was her doing because it was a requirement for the ritual to work. Or maybe there were vampires there. Maybe she was the vampire that was sort of perpetrating this whole thing. Who knows? Do I think this is likely? Not really, no. But it's a neat thing to think about. Now, as for the rest of this theory, I think this theory could actually be fairly solid. The timeline definitely matches up. And, I mean, the way that the skill is structured matches with the way that I've theorized her, lifetime has progressed. So I don't know. I think I could be right about this, but I mean, I could just be insane, right? I could just be drawing lines that aren't there, and Blue Pocket's gonna put out an Eternity story. It's gonna be something completely different from what I said, and I'm gonna feel really dumb. But for now, I do think that is what she is. So that's pretty much it for the story section, or the relevant story pieces at least. But before this section ends, I would like to just talk about how the Mercy Brown case resolved, because a body not rotting is pretty freaky. Yeah, she wasn't a vampire. Maybe in the reverse world where stuff like that exists, maybe, but in the real world, no, she wasn't a vampire. What had happened was that Mercy Brown had died in January. At that time, the ground was still too hard to dig in, so what they did was they placed her in an above ground casket for the winter, right? Which would mean that her body had basically frozen. Come the spring, when it was the ground was soft enough to dig, they placed her in the ground, which was still cold. And I guess it was cold enough that her body remained frozen and preserved until it was disinterred, and the people, cut out her heart and liver and fed them to her brother. Man, that's wild. But yeah, no, that's how the Mercy Brown case ended. So that's basically all for Eternity. We don't exactly have a whole lot to work with. All we really get are her voice lines and anything on her bio page, which it's not a ton, but I do feel like we were able to pull out quite a bit of information just from, making inferences based on what little we were actually given. But that's pretty much as far as we're gonna get, I think, until we get like some sort of story. I don't know if the game will actually give stories to older characters, or if this is all just for like their whatever gets thrown into the gotcha next. Either way, that's gonna be it for this video, so thank you all for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.